Welcome to Forum 360. Thank you for joining us on our global outlook with a local view. This is Leslie Unger, your host today. I grew up in a family business. Back then, a family business was thought of as brick and mortar. On one of my favorite shows, no judgment please, Blue Bloods, police work is referred to as the family business. Our guest today, you might say, comes from a family business. His grandmother was a writer, his father an editor at the Boston Globe, his mother a journalist, and I believe from what I've read, his oldest daughter is either on her way to going into the family business or in the family business. Adam Mansbach is a novelist and author, a screenwriter, a cultural critic, a humorist, and was a DJ, just to name a few things at which he excels. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Go the F to Sleep, narrated by Samuel L. Jackson. I have found that if you are of a certain generation, no matter where I have been in this country or outside of this country, people not only know this book, they are rabid fans. Everyone's favorite curmudgeon, Larry David, narrated the audio for F. Now There Are Two of You. If you are not of that generation, from his huge resume, let me just add screenwriter for the 2016 Netflix movie Barry, about President Obama's junior year at Columbia, and was it Super High? We are thrilled to welcome Adam Mansbach. So welcome to Forum 360.
Thank you.
In high school, I remember stumbling upon this quote by Hemingway. There is nothing to writing. All you do is sit at a typewriter and bleed. I think about that often, although it may or may not actually have been said by Hemingway. Bleeding and writing are kind of a part of a literary culture. So you have written in so many different genres. How do you weigh in on the writing and bleeding?
I think probably it helps to be as drunk as Hemingway was when he was sitting at that typewriter. But I do, it's interesting. It's a great question. I do think that we are trained often to feel that the best work comes from pain and that you can't do anything worthwhile unless you are scouring your soul. And I think sometimes that's the case. Certainly for me, there are projects that involve that kind of digging, that kind of depth, that kind of excavation. And I value those projects. There are also projects where I'm just having fun. And it took me a long time to realize that those were also legitimate projects and that I didn't have to bleed for everything, that I could bleed selectively.
Bleed selectively.
Way,
okay.
Yeah, and that it makes sense to bleed sometimes, and it's a detriment at other times. Just like it's not always appropriate to burst out into tears. Sometimes that's what you have to do. Sometimes you're at an Olive Garden, so.
So I read somewhere, although I could not go back and prove it, that you write, when you're at your summer home, you write at the kitchen table. Did I read that?
You may have read that even in the acknowledgments to the Golem of Brooklyn, where I
Yes.
shout out some of my relatives and accuse them of being unhelpful, which is of course a joke because the joke is I'm writing in the middle of the most chaotic room in a shared summer home where there are 5 teenagers and 2 little kids running around at all times. And this is where I choose to plant myself. There are bedrooms in this house.
So
I'm always in the middle of it, yeah.
I found that, so you purposely choose to write where it's more chaotic than where you are isolated. So tell us about that.
I don't always do that. I mean, I do the bulk of my writing in a studio connected to my house with a closed door that I keep locked so that my children don't barge in on me. But I have over the years often chosen to write in a crowded, bustling cafe or during the summers in the middle of the chaos that is the summer home that I share with my family. I think there's something about the tuning out of noise, conversation, laughter that paradoxically seems to focus me. I like the energy, and I suppose like to test my own ability to focus and create in the midst of that kind of craziness. At all times, I have three children, so there's never any, actual peace or quiet in my house, except when they're at school.
Now, are you the kind of person that says, I'm going to sit down and write for X number of hours a day, or until I write this many words, or what is your process as a, quote, trained novelist?
It really is project dependent. I mean, if I'm writing a novel, then I am sort of trying to hit a certain word count every day. This is a game that you play with yourself. Sometimes you hit that count, sometimes you don't. There are no penalties for not hitting that count.
It's like me and my Peloton.
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm lucky in that I love to work. I love to write. The actual act of writing is not painful for me. The preparation can be, the not writing can be, the feeling of finishing a project and being at loose ends can be. But when I'm actually in the middle of a project, I'm kind of at my best. I'm kind of at my happiest. I feel energized. I feel fulfilled. So I'm not forcing a quota on myself. It's more like when the workday is done, I can't resist picking the computer back up and reading over what I wrote or editing, because it's joyful for me. It's like a process that engages my whole being in a way that I find to be kind of wonderful. So if something is a slog, that's when it's like, okay, time to put away, everything else and force yourself to be at that desk. That's happened sometimes, but that's not me at my sort of creative best. That's me when I'm like being forced to do something I don't want to do, which also happens.
Well, when you talk about your summer home, and it's in Martha's Vineyard,
Yeah.
right? When I was like 6 years old, we went on a family vacation to Martha's Vineyard, which became a standard joke in our family. My dad was so miserable that I have to, in honor of him, I have to ask you, I imagine there's a huge difference between vacationing there and being a resident there. Tell us what is good about Martha's Vineyard.
It's funny that you say that. There was a New Yorker profile recently of my friend Scott Frank, who's a screenwriter, in which he talks about going to Martha's Vineyard, and his quote was hilarious. And I don't know if I can, I'll paraphrase it on the air. He said something like, like many, many a-holes before me, I spend my summers on Martha's Vineyard. And I was like, that's it, Scott. I immediately texted that quote to him. It's funny. I mean, for me, being on Martha's Vineyard is probably not what is implied by the notion of being on Martha's Vineyard. I don't go out. I don't socialize. I don't see people. I'm not attending parties. I am in one of three places. I'm either in my house working, and this is a house that's been in my family for 60 years that my grandparents built. My grandmother used to write poems in that house. Her house guests used to come and write whatever they were working on in the house. She was, there's stories about Bernard Malamud sitting in that room and writing poems. Of course, he was writing, I think, part of the assistant in that house. Of course, he and my grandmother were both smart enough to do it in a room with a door that closed. I'm the one in the middle of the living room. I'm either in my house working or taking care of my kids, or I'm swimming at the beach, or I'm going to the fish store. It's very stripped down for me. I'm very hard to find there. The only people I see are on the beach or house guests that I've invited. So it's really a meditative time, and it's kind of life at its simplest to me, and I'm surrounded by some of my favorite people. So it's wonderful and lovely, but it's not sort of the glitz and glamour that you might associate with the Vineyard. These houses that we have are not winterized. They're basically just like collection of sticks in the shape of a house. They're very near the ocean.
Is it an outside shower?
Yep, got the outdoor shower, all of that. Very like rustic,
There was a duck on your beach at Martha's Vineyard that made it into both my eulogy and my sister's eulogy for my dad. That duck became so famous. So
Wow.
that's the tie. That's the tie that we have to there. I read that there was a bidding war for Super High, for your screenplay for Super High. Now, perhaps we can fantasize about a bidding war over our house when we sell it, but can you talk about what is a bidding war over your work like?
It's pretty dizzying. And my relationship with Hollywood over the years has taken many turns. But one of the things that remains fascinating and frustrating to me is oftentimes the industry moves extremely slow. The pace is so glacial that it makes you want to scream, and you're calling your reps and you're trying to speed things up. But the reason it's so frustrating is that occasionally, when they want to, they move with incredible speed. That's happened to me on just a couple of occasions, but it kind of reveals how quickly they're able to move. And A Bidding War is one of those situations. This was a movie that we were pitching around town, and we had a cast attached. And I don't flatter myself. The story was good, the pitch was good. I did a good job, I think, pitching it over Zoom in a 95-degree room in the middle of summer, in the middle of the pandemic. But really, the fact that we had Andy Samberg, Craig Robinson, and Common attached to the movie is a good portion of why everybody was so excited. But A Bidding War is crazy. Offers are coming in at a rapid rate. You're getting calls from your reps after each pitch. People are like trying to take the thing off the table or upping their offers when they hear the next offer. Rumors are flying. You can almost feel the buzz. And it's exciting. But it also doesn't ultimately mean anything necessarily. Like, that movie will probably never get made.
Which is something that, we don't understand. Right.
I don't understand it either. But I got the check cleared, so you keep moving on with your life, And for me, this is why I could never just be a screenwriter, because you have no control. So either you have to find mediums where you actually have control over your art, your production to some extent. For me, that's writing novels. It's writing other kinds of things that are not dependent on an army of people and do not take millions of dollars to realize. I think just doing that would be really infuriating. For me, anytime I write a screenplay, I know that should I choose to, I can repurpose that idea, those lines, that work in some other way. It can end up in a book someday.
Now, you are referred to as a humorist. Can you tell us first, what is the difference between a humorist and a comedian?
In my mind, a comedian is someone who does stand-up comedy.
Okay. And a
Whereas
humorist?
Somebody whose work takes some other form is someone who is writing for others in some way or another. Writing humorous books, or maybe behind the scenes writing for actors or writing for comedians even. Now,
if you're known as a humorist, do people expect you to be funny? Like, I think that people expect a comedian to be funny all the time. If they run into him at Starbucks or on an airplane, that we expect him to be funny. Do people expect a humorist to be funny?
I think people expect me to be funny. I would be offended if people did not expect me to be funny.
So, there are a lot of famous Jewish comedians, right? There have been through history. There are now with Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David. Is there some kind of a connection between being Jewish and being funny?
Yes.
And what is it?
That part is harder to answer. Pete, it's funny. I wrote a book with Dave Barry and Alan Zweibel a few years ago called A Field Guide to the Jewish People. And often we would get a question like this when we were on stage in Florida. The entire book tour took place in Florida. We were doing matinee shows at JCC's for 500 people. Alan is 73 and he'd be the youngest person in the room. But often the first question was, what is Jewish humor? And my response was always, well, first of all, have you ever heard of Christian humor? It's not a thing. So we can start right there. To me, Jewish humor can take a lot of forms, and it's hard to pin down exactly what it is or why Jews are funny. Not all Jews are funny, by the way. My father-in-law is not funny at all. But,
does he laugh when you say that?
No.
Okay.
No, he doesn't.
Then he really isn't funny. Okay.
No, not at all. I think there's something about comedy is often about punching up, right? Jews for most of our history have had nowhere else but up to punch. There's a lot of ways in which Jewish humor can sort of turn anti-Semitism around on the anti-Semite, can be incisive and clever and also self-deprecating, all in in one joke. You know, there are Jewish jokes that are so poignant and so funny and so cutting that to me they do the work of an entire novel. And some of those jokes are also so divisive that if you tell them in a room full of people, half of them will laugh and the other half will be offended. My favorite Jewish joke is a joke that my mother has repeatedly asked me to never again tell in public, for example. It goes like this.
Okay.
This Jewish guy moves in next door to Rockefeller, and he buys the same car as Rockefeller. His house is just as big. He even hires the same gardener to trim the hedges. And one day Rockefeller comes out of his house and looks over and he's like, "Hey, you think you're as good as me, don't you?" Jewish guy's like, "As good as you? I think I'm better than you." Rockefeller is furious, demands to know why. The guy's like, "Well, for one thing, I don't live next door to a Jew." To me, that joke has everything and does everything. And some people love it, and my mother is like, "I will disown you if you continue to tell that joke."
We won't tell her. Today we are talking with Adam Mansbach, New York Times bestseller author, screenplay writer, poet, novelist, and humorist. You said, when I heard you speak in Cleveland, that for, I believe it was Larry David narrating your last book, F, there are two of you, that you had a choice of staying at home on Martha's Vineyard or going to the studio when he was narrating it, and you chose to stay. I have to ask you, when does being around famous people become something that you can be nonchalant about?
I don't think I've ever been chalant about it, ever. I mean, somebody asked me once, like, of everybody that I've met, like, who was I most starstruck by? Who was I most excited by? The answer is Rock Ness Monster of the 90s rap group Helter Skelter. You know what I mean? Like,
Your
that's
music
who
background.
This is what I'm impressed by, is like rappers from the 90s that I used to listen to when I was 18 and trooping around New York City in like a bubble coat and Timberland boots. It's not, you know, Sam Jackson or Richard Gere or whoever, you know, like, I don't know. It's people impress me if they're funny. People impress me if they're smart. People impress me with wit, not with stature. So it's never really been a thing. I think I was telling that story about Larry David to explain what I assume to be the reason that Larry and I have an unspoken bond. Which is that, yes, I refuse to fly across the country to supervise his recording session because I didn't want to like leave my beach house. And I think when Larry heard that, he was like, "I like this guy," you know, because it seems like something he would do. So this is my joke about the bond between me and Larry.
I can admire that. Your latest book, I couldn't do it, but I can admire it. Your latest book, The Golem of Brooklyn. As I was reading this book, and I'm a little familiar with the concept of a golem, but all I could think about was, I was laughing at myself. When I was in college, I didn't smoke anything. But all I could think of was, if I smoked anything, that this is like something that you must come up with when you smoke something, because where did this concept come from?
Well, I've been fascinated with the golem in Jewish folklore for quite some time. For those who don't know, a golem is a humanoid creature 9-10 feet tall, made out of mud or clay, and brought to life through esoteric, secret rituals and prayers, always by a rabbi, always at a time of emergency for the Jewish people. And I had the comic idea for a long time of someone utterly unqualified to make a golem, making a golem for all of the wrong reasons. And in the book, the golem is made not because there's a crisis, but because this guy, Len Bronstein, simply has a lot of clay lying around and is extremely stoned. And he manages to bring this golem to life, and it starts screaming at him in Yiddish, which he doesn't speak, and trashing his apartment, and you know, things go from there. I had that idea for a while, but that's a skit. That's not a novel. That's like something you would see on Saturday Night Live, and it would be funny for 2 minutes, and then it would drag on interminably for another 9 minutes. Meanwhile, though, I was also toying with a bunch of other ideas for other projects, including something that dealt with epigenetics, which is the idea of trauma entering the genetic record and being passed down from generation to generation. And I had kind of a eureka moment. I realized that if I made the golem a creature with an ancestral memory, in other words, the golem in my book is not made, he's remade. There's only been one golem throughout all of history, and he remembers each previous iteration of himself, and he carries around with him all of the history, all of the memory, all of the trauma of all of these previous lives. I realized that through that vehicle, I could explore these ideas of epigenetic trauma in a different kind of way, and that felt like a novel. So those two ideas kind of fused together, and that got me writing.
That was, it is a book that you can't, I have a really bad habit, I always have. I always read the last chapter first of a book. I should not ever admit this to a novelist, but I read the last chapter first. But this is a book that it doesn't do any good because it will take twists and turns that you cannot expect, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, on a completely different, and I want to just get this in our few minutes remaining. Your book, Once I Had a Brother, is about your brother, and one thing I found really interesting was that when he first passed away, you actually told a classmate of his that asked about him, you didn't say that he had passed away and that you said he was fine, basically. And then 8 years later, you wrote this book. And you have even performed it. You performed it at Oberlin. Can you just tell us briefly about the journey from not being able to talk about it, because I totally can understand that, to writing about it and performing about it?
Yeah. My younger brother, David, took his own life in 2011. And I always knew I would write about it. That's just my way of grappling with the world. But it took me about 8 years to write a single word. I was not emotionally ready. I hadn't found the form to write it in. I was thinking of everything from novels to screenplay, essay. The idea of writing it as a long poem didn't occur to me until it occurred to me. And I found that form unlocked the ability to kind of go in and write it. And I wrote the book in a very intense 3-week period where I really sort of did nothing else. And, the process of writing the book took me places in my own grief that I hadn't really been. It allowed me to make connections that I had not made in those ensuing 8 years. One of the strange things about my brother's death is that it happened to happen at a time when I was sort of at my most public. My book, Go the F to Sleep, had just come out. I was doing tons of television and travel and all kinds of things. So I was balancing this kind of public performance of joy with this sort of secret grief and shock. And a lot of the book is about grappling with that dichotomy and processing the grief. And, the book kind of delves into family history and the idea of masks, things about our own nominal Judaism and the ritual and what mourning looks like, whether one can make up a ritual as one goes along or whether a ritual can only be kind of a received thing. In some sense, the whole 8 years that I didn't write that book, I felt like everything else I was writing was in avoidance of writing some version of that book. I was not unproductive. I wrote screenplays and children's books and humor books and all kinds of things, but I wasn't writing the thing I needed to write. And it was very liberating in some ways to write that book. And then the book was published in the midst of the pandemic, so I never got the chance to tour the book. So as you say, recently, I performed it in its entirety for the first time at Oberlin College, accompanied by I call him my nephew. He's technically my cousin's stepson, but Max Kasoy and several other musicians in the Oberlin jazz program. And it was a beautiful experience, and I hope to perform it more. My biggest project in 2024, in fact, is a screenplay loosely based on that book. The book is called I Had a Brother Once. The screenplay, the movie, is called Boom. And if all goes well, I will be directing that movie this year.
Directing it. So we heard it here, directing it. Now, in a word or two, who do you like to pick up and read?
I mean, one of the great things about being a writer is that each project sort of has a discrete set of influences on it. So your favorite writers and your touchstone writers, some remain the same throughout your career, but in other ways it changes with each project. I mean, some of the names that come to mind that I sort of always go back to are Roberto Bolaño, Russell Banks. I really like Murakami. Those are a few people off top, but it changes all the time, you know.
In a word, and my last question, in a word, what gives you hope?
At the risk of being corny, my children.
Children. Okay. I admire all writers, but let me just review all the genres our guest today has successfully written in. Humor, the F-books, anger, Rage is Back, Angry Black White Boy. He's written about religion and the end of the Jews and the Golem of Brooklyn, and written about depression and suicide. And I had a brother, once I had a brother, and pop culture and Barry and Super High. This doesn't even touch upon his background in music. Perhaps one thing we can learn from him is that we can have a bigger footprint than we may think we can have. Thanks to Adam Mansbach, New York Times bestselling author, for letting us into his life and for touching ours. I'm Leslie Unger. Thank you for joining us on Forum 360 for a global outlook with a local view.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.